Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it.
The Truck Cemetery.
The road stretched endlessly before me, a ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the growing darkness. I'd been driving for hours, the monotonous hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of the tires against the pavement lulling me into a near-sleep state. Fatigue gnawed at my concentration, and my eyelids felt like they were weighted down with lead. My usual route had been shut down for roadwork, forcing me onto this unfamiliar detour. The GPS had given up trying to find a straightforward way through, and I was left navigating the winding, shadowy roads by sheer instinct. The sky was a deepening shade of twilight, streaked with heavy, oppressive clouds. The fog began to roll in, curling around the edges of the road like ghostly fingers. The headlights of my truck cut through the mist, illuminating the road ahead in a stark, artificial glow. Everything beyond the reach of the headlights was swallowed by the encroaching darkness, adding to the eerie isolation of the landscape. As I rounded a bend, the headlights flickered over a rusted sign barely visible through the fog. The faded, peeling paint revealed the words, "Truck Graveyard, No Trespassing," scrawled in once bold letters that had long since lost their vibrancy. The sign looked like it had been abandoned alongside whatever lay beyond it. My curiosity was piqued, a sharp contrast to the growing sense of unease settling in my gut. I slowed the truck and turned off onto a gravel path that led away from the main road. The gravel crunched beneath the tires, the sound oddly loud in the stillness of the fog-draped night. The path twisted and turned, bordered by overgrown weeds and the skeletal remains of old trees. As I drove deeper, the fog thickened, wrapping the world in a dense, damp shroud. The path opened up into a wide clearing that stretched out before me like a forgotten wasteland. My headlights revealed a sprawling expanse of rusted and abandoned trucks, their metal frames covered in layers of grime and creeping moss. The vehicles stood like silent sentinels, their broken windows and corroded bodies a testament to years of neglect and decay. The sight was unsettling, an eerie graveyard of once mighty machines now reduced to relics of a bygone era. Despite the ominous feeling that gripped me, I was compelled to explore. It seemed like a strange adventure, a brief diversion from the monotony of the road. I told myself it would only be a quick look around, just enough to stretch my legs and satisfy my curiosity. Little did I know that this detour would lead me into a realm of unsettling discovery and unimaginable terror. The truck graveyard unfolded before me like a forgotten wasteland, its enormity far surpassing my initial impression. Rows upon rows of abandoned vehicles sprawled out in every direction, their metal carcasses jutting up through the fog like the bones of a long-dead giant. The graveyard seemed to stretch endlessly, swallowed by the oppressive darkness and encroaching mist. The silence was palpable, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by the wind and the distant, mournful creak of old metal settling into its final resting place. I stepped out of the truck and clicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the inky blackness. The light revealed a desolate landscape of broken glass and decaying interiors, where the once bright colors of the trucks had faded into muted hues of gray and brown. The headlights of my truck cast long, eerie shadows that danced along the rusting hulks, making the scene feel even more surreal. As I wandered deeper into the graveyard, a creeping chill began to seep into my bones, and my breath formed faint clouds in the cold air. The stillness of the graveyard seemed to amplify every sound. My footsteps reverberated strangely, creating an unsettling echo that seemed to bounce off the walls of metal and decay. An inexplicable sense of being watched prickled at the back of my neck, though I could see no one and hear nothing other than the haunting stillness. My flashlight's beam swept across the wrecks, illuminating the faded and battered exteriors of the trucks. Their once proud features were now hidden beneath layers of grime and rust, their wheels sunk deep into the earth as if trying to escape their fate. It was then that I noticed a particularly old truck, its paintwork long since worn away and its tires half buried in the dirt. The truck seemed to call out to me, its very presence compelling me to approach. As I drew closer, the beam of my flashlight flickered over something unusual lying in the dirt beside the truck. It was an old journal, partially buried under a blanket of grime and debris. The cover was tattered and stained, but the edges of the pages were just visible. My curiosity got the better of me, and I knelt down to examine it more closely. I wiped away the dirt with a trembling hand and opened the journal. Inside, the pages were filled with handwritten notes and crude sketches. The handwriting was hurried and disjointed, scrawled in ink that had faded over time. The sketches depicted scenes of horror, dark, foreboding figures and cryptic symbols that seemed to pulse with an eerie significance. The notes were fragmented, mentioning strange occurrences, disappearances, and a sense of something lurking just out of sight. The further I read, the more the sense of dread deepened. It was clear that the journal belonged to someone who had witnessed or experienced something terrifying. The last entry, written in shaky script, spoke of an entity that haunted the graveyard, something that would never let go, always waiting in the shadows. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I closed the journal and looked up. The sense of being watched had intensified, and the shadows around me seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive. I felt an overwhelming urge to leave, but the sense of unease kept me rooted to the spot. The journal had opened a door to something sinister, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had once belonged to the pages was still very much present in the darkness of the graveyard. As I flipped through the journal's pages, a creeping sense of dread took hold. The entries grew increasingly erratic and desperate, painting a chilling picture of the graveyard's dark history. The writer spoke of the place with palpable fear, describing it as a haven for tragedy and a final resting place for those who had vanished without a trace. The last few pages were a chaotic mess of frantic scrawls and broken thoughts, revealing a growing terror that mirrored my own unease. Each entry detailed the writer's experiences with mounting horror. They wrote about hearing whispers in the dead of night, their words indistinct but laced with menace. They spoke of shadowy figures that seemed to flit just beyond the edge of vision, always present but never fully visible. The writer's fear was evident, their handwriting deteriorating into wild, shaky lines as they described the sensation of being relentlessly pursued by unseen eyes. My pulse quickened as I processed the implications of what I was reading. The author's vivid descriptions of the supernatural occurrences seemed to be coming to life around me. The whispers began to seep into my consciousness, soft, ghostly murmurs carried by the wind, too faint to make out but persistent in their presence. My flashlight beam caught fleeting glimpses of shadows darting among the trucks, always just outside of my direct line of sight, adding to the eerie atmosphere. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but the physical sensations told a different story. The temperature dropped abruptly, a bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep from the very ground beneath me. My breath became visible in the frigid air, each exhale forming a ghostly cloud that hung in the darkness. The once stale air now felt dense and oppressive, as if the graveyard itself was exhaling its own sinister breath. A wave of panic surged through me as I looked up from the journal. The shadows seemed to thicken and writhe, their shapes distorting in the dim light of my flashlight. The whispers grew louder, a disconcerting chorus of indistinguishable voices that seemed to echo off the metal and concrete. The feeling of being watched was now overwhelming, an almost tangible force pressing against my senses. I took a few hesitant steps backward, my mind racing to make sense of what was happening. The disjointed reality of the graveyard and the journal's chilling contents were merging into a nightmarish experience. Every creak of metal and gust of wind seemed to be a deliberate part of an unseen entity's game, designed to unnerve and frighten me. As the whispers grew more insistent, I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but the shadows and whispers seemed to conspire against my escape. I glanced around, trying to gauge the direction of the truck graveyard's exit, but the maze of decaying vehicles and encroaching fog made it impossible to discern. The journal's terrifying warnings now felt like a cruel premonition, and I could only hope that I could escape before whatever was lurking in the shadows decided to make its presence known. Panic set in as the unsettling realization hit me: I wasn't alone in the graveyard. The eerie silence that had enveloped the area was now punctuated by the sound of footsteps echoing my own. Each step I took seemed to be mirrored by another set of footsteps, growing steadily closer and more insistent. The rhythm was almost synchronized, and the unsettling sound sent waves of fear crashing over me. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Shadows danced among the decaying trucks, flickering in and out of view as if they were living entities. The shapes were dark and indistinct, their forms shifting and writhing in the dim light. They seemed to move with an unnatural fluidity, disappearing behind the rusting hulks only to reappear somewhere else, always just out of reach. The whispers had intensified, rising from a faint murmur to a cacophony of disembodied voices. The tones were urgent and frantic, their words blending into a disorienting jumble. It felt as though the whispers were coming from all directions, swirling around me and forming an oppressive wall of sound. The voices were both haunting and maddening, their repeated pleas and warnings becoming almost unbearable. I caught a glimpse of something in the distance, an outline of a figure standing among the wrecks. The shape was vague and shadowy, lacking any distinct features. It was as if the figure was an embodiment of the darkness itself, a silhouette that melded with the gloom. I tried to focus on the figure, but the more I looked, the more it seemed to distort and waver, as if it were part of a mirage. The presence of this figure filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as if the very air around me had thickened with malevolence, pressing down on me with a palpable weight. My heart raced, each beat echoing in my ears as I felt the encroaching darkness closing in. The whispers and shadows seemed to converge, creating an atmosphere of imminent danger. The realization hit me like a jolt of electricity. I had to leave, and I had to do it now. I fumbled with the flashlight, my hands shaking as I tried to get my bearings. The feeling of being watched was suffocating, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to escape. I turned and sprinted back towards the truck, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I pushed through the oppressive darkness. The footsteps behind me grew louder, a relentless echo that seemed to chase me through the graveyard. My flashlight's beam bobbed erratically as I ran, casting eerie shadows on the broken trucks that loomed like silent sentinels. The whispers surged into a deafening roar, a haunting chorus that seemed to follow my every move. As I reached the truck, I fumbled with the keys, my fingers numb with fear. The engine roared to life with a deafening growl, and I slammed the gearshift into drive, desperately tearing away from the gas station. The headlights cut through the fog and darkness, revealing the ghostly shapes of the trucks receding into the distance. I didn't dare look back, but the feeling of being pursued lingered, a chilling reminder of the malevolent presence that still haunted the shadows of the graveyard. The road stretched out before me, but I couldn't shake the image of that shadowy figure and the echo of those frantic whispers. The terror of the night was imprinted in my mind, a grim reminder of the horrors that lurk in the forgotten corners of the world. I sprinted back to my truck, my breath coming in ragged gasps as adrenaline surged through my veins. The darkness seemed to close in around me, the oppressive weight of the shadows pressing against my back. The whispers had turned into a cacophony of desperate pleas and menacing murmurs, a haunting symphony that echoed through the graveyard with an unnerving intensity. My hands shook uncontrollably as I fumbled with the keys, the metal feeling cold and foreign against my sweaty palms. I finally managed to insert the key into the ignition and turned it with a forceful twist. The engine roared to life with a violent growl, the sound slicing through the oppressive silence like a lifeline. I threw the truck into gear and slammed the gas pedal, the tires screeching as they gripped the gravel and spun me towards the exit. The headlights cut through the fog and darkness, illuminating the rows of abandoned trucks that seemed to loom and sway in the periphery of my vision. The shadows appeared to reach out, their dark fingers clawing at the edges of the light, but I forced myself to concentrate on the road ahead. The truck's engine roared with an angry ferocity, propelling me forward through the fog that seemed to writhe and coil around the vehicle. Each bump and jolt on the rough road felt like a reminder of the nightmare I was fleeing. My heart pounded violently in my chest, a relentless drumbeat that matched the thundering sound of the engine. As I finally reached the main highway, the fog and shadows of the graveyard began to recede, replaced by the faint glow of distant streetlights and the hum of civilization. The overwhelming sense of dread started to ease, but the terror of what I had experienced clung to me like a second skin. The highway stretched out before me, its familiarity a stark contrast to the nightmarish scene I had just escaped. The memory of that night, the ghostly figures, the desperate whispers, and the shadowy presence, haunted me as I drove. I could still feel the chilling presence of the graveyard, an intangible weight that lingered in the back of my mind. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those dark shapes following me, but the road was clear, stretching endlessly into the darkness. As dawn began to break, casting a pale light over the landscape, I finally felt the grip of fear start to loosen. The morning light was a welcome relief, but it did little to erase the memory of the graveyard. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a collection of old trucks. It was a place haunted by restless spirits, a tragic monument to those who had vanished into the night. The road continued before me, and I drove on, my mind still reeling from the night's horrors. The graveyard had been a chilling reminder of the dangers that lurk in forgotten places, and I knew that the memory of that place would forever be etched into my soul. As I left it behind, the terror of the night still lingered, a haunting reminder of the dark and unexplained mysteries that lie hidden in the shadows. The Last Convoy.
It was supposed to be just another routine haul, nothing out of the ordinary. The route through the Midwest was one I knew like the back of my hand. Long stretches of highway, quiet small towns, and endless miles of farmland. The kind of drive where you could set the cruise control and let your mind wander. But that night, everything changed. The weather had been fine when I started out. A few clouds, but nothing that gave me pause. But as the miles ticked by, the sky began to darken, heavy clouds rolling in like a tide. I could feel the pressure drop, the air thickening with the promise of a storm. It wasn't long before the first drops of rain spattered against the windshield, quickly escalating into a deluge. The kind of rain that pounds against the roof and turns the road into a slick, treacherous ribbon. Thunder growled in the distance, a low, ominous rumble that seemed to vibrate through the cab of the truck. The radio, which had been my only company, started cutting out, the signal crackling with static. I flipped it off, leaving me alone with the roar of the storm and the rhythmic thrum of the wipers fighting a losing battle against the rain. Visibility dropped to near zero, the headlights barely cutting through the sheets of rain. I tightened my grip on the wheel, muscles tensing as I fought to keep the truck steady on the winding road. The isolation of the highway, which I usually found comforting, now felt oppressive. There wasn't another vehicle in sight, just me and the storm, and the miles of empty road stretching out ahead. Then I saw it up ahead, emerging from the curtain of rain like a mirage. A convoy of trucks, moving slowly through the downpour. At first, I thought it was a welcome sight, other drivers fighting the same battle against the elements. But as I drew closer, something struck me as off. Their lights were off, not just dimmed, but completely dark, their hulking shapes barely visible in the night. A shiver ran down my spine, but I pushed it aside. Maybe their lights had shorted out in the storm, or maybe they were trying to conserve power. It wasn't unheard of. I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation, even as unease gnawed at the edges of my mind. I hesitated for just a moment before deciding to follow them. With the storm growing fiercer by the minute, sticking with the convoy seemed like the safer option. Maybe they knew a shortcut, a safer route through the storm that I wasn't aware of. Or maybe it was just the comfort of not being alone on that hellish stretch of road. But as I settled in behind the last truck, matching their slow, deliberate pace, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just made a terrible mistake. The dark silhouettes of the trucks loomed ahead, silent and foreboding, like ghost ships drifting through a stormy sea. And though I tried to focus on the road, on keeping my own truck steady, I couldn't help but feel that something was very, very wrong. The storm raged on, the rain beating down harder, the wind howling like a banshee. But it wasn't the storm that scared me anymore. It was the convoy, those silent, lightless trucks, leading me deeper into the night. And no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were leading me somewhere I didn't want to go. The longer I followed the convoy, the more the unease gnawed at me. At first, I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, that I was just imagining things. But as the miles stretched on, the nagging feeling that something was seriously wrong became impossible to ignore. The trucks ahead of me moved with an unsettling grace, their dark forms gliding through the storm as if completely unaffected by the relentless wind and rain. The way they kept perfect formation, despite the treacherous conditions, struck me as unnatural. No brake lights flickered, no turn signals flashed. It was as if they were moving through the night on a predetermined path, oblivious to the chaos around them. I reached for the radio, hoping to make contact with one of the drivers, to hear another human voice, to find some reassurance that I wasn't alone in this. But my calls went unanswered. Static filled the cab, a harsh, grating noise that only amplified my growing sense of isolation. I tried again, switching channels, but there was nothing. Just the storm and the static and the silent convoy ahead. My heart began to pound in my chest, a steady thud that seemed to echo the beat of the rain against the windshield. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to get away from those trucks. But when I glanced in the mirrors, the road behind me seemed to twist and blur, the familiar lines of the highway distorted by the rain and darkness. I could barely make out the road I had just traveled, and a cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I had always prided myself on knowing these roads, on being able to navigate through any kind of weather. But now everything was wrong. The landmarks I had driven past countless times, signs, billboards, even the shape of the treeline, were gone, swallowed by the night. The road seemed to narrow and wind in ways that didn't make sense, as if it were leading me somewhere entirely different, somewhere I didn't recognize. Panic bubbled up inside me. I had to turn around, had to get off this road. But every time I tried to slow down or pull away from the convoy, the trucks ahead of me would slow too, as if they were waiting for me, ensuring I stayed right where I was. It was as if the road itself was conspiring to keep me trapped, driving me deeper into the storm. My hands tightened on the wheel, knuckles white as I tried to maintain control. But the storm was getting worse, the wind howling louder, the rain a relentless hammering against the cab. The road ahead twisted and turned, unfamiliar and disorienting, and I realized with growing horror that I was completely lost. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I had strayed far from my intended route. I wasn't just lost. I was somewhere I wasn't supposed to be, following trucks that had no business being on this road. The landscape outside had transformed into a shadowy, nightmarish version of what it should have been. Familiarity had melted away, replaced by a sense of impending doom. I tried to turn back to retrace my steps, but it was as if the road had a mind of its own. Every attempt to reverse course only led me further into the unknown. What had once been a straight highway now felt like a labyrinth, each turn leading me deeper into the darkness. Fear tightened its grip on me. I was trapped, lost in a storm that felt like it would never end, following a convoy that seemed to be leading me to the edge of the world. And no matter how hard I tried to escape, the road kept pulling me back in, dragging me further away from everything I knew, into the heart of the storm. Panic had a way of creeping in slowly, like a chill that settled deep into your bones. At first, I thought it was just the storm getting to me, playing tricks on my mind. But the longer I drove, the more it became clear. I was trapped in some kind of nightmarish loop. I tried to keep calm, tried to reason with myself. I'd driven these roads for years, knew them like the back of my hand. How could I be lost? But the reality was undeniable. Every attempt to escape the convoy, to turn around and find my way back, only led me to the same stretch of road. The landmarks that had once guided me were gone, swallowed by the relentless darkness and the pounding rain. The convoy remained ahead, like a dark specter guiding me through this twisted maze. I could never quite catch up to it, and no matter how fast I drove, I couldn't overtake the trucks. They seemed to drift just out of reach, like mirages fading when I got too close. The storm raged on, the wind howling with a ferocity that felt almost alive, as if it were conspiring against me. Each gust of wind made the truck sway dangerously, and the road became increasingly treacherous, with puddles forming deep enough to almost pull me off course. Desperation set in as I drove in circles, hoping for a way out, a sign that I was heading in the right direction. But instead of finding an escape, I started to notice things that only deepened my fear. A figure appeared briefly on the side of the road, standing still, shrouded in rain and mist. As I got closer, it vanished without a trace, like a ghost slipping through the storm. My heart pounded as I scanned the road for any sign of what I'd just seen, but there was nothing. Shadows darted across the highway, moving too quickly for me to make out their shapes. They seemed to flit in and out of sight, like dark phantoms playing hide and seek. I saw distant, ghostly lights flickering in the fog, their dim glow casting eerie, shifting patterns on the road ahead. The lights seemed to beckon, drawing me in, but when I tried to approach them, they disappeared as if they had never been there. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. Was this some sort of elaborate prank, a nightmare brought on by exhaustion? Or was I truly trapped in some kind of supernatural loop? Rational explanations fell apart like the storm-worn road beneath me. No matter how hard I tried to think clearly, the impossible nature of my situation refused to make sense. The longer I followed the convoy, the more the storm seemed to conspire against me. The wind howled louder, the rain beat down harder, and the road twisted in impossible ways. My truck's headlights cut through the gloom, revealing a path that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere all at once. The sense of being trapped, of moving in circles, became almost unbearable. Every corner I turned led me back to the same stretch of road, the same silent convoy gliding through the storm. The fear clawed at my insides, twisting my thoughts into knots. I was caught in a loop, trapped in a storm that wouldn't end, and the convoy was both my tormentor and my only guide through this nightmarish landscape. As the storm raged on, I could only hope that somehow, someway, I would find a way out before the endless loop claimed me completely. The psychological strain was starting to wear me down, eroding my sanity like the storm was eroding the road beneath me. I hadn't slept properly in what felt like days, and the exhaustion was beginning to twist my perception of reality. My thoughts became disjointed, fragments of anxiety and fear swirling around in my head like the storm outside. The cacophony of the storm was no longer just an external force. It seemed to seep into the cab of my truck, making it feel like I was encased in a moving prison. The wind roared and the rain pounded, a relentless symphony of chaos. I could swear I heard whispers carried on the wind, indistinct voices murmuring unintelligible secrets just out of reach. The darkness outside pressed in, suffocating, making the cab feel like a tiny, claustrophobic cell. My own breathing sounded ragged and alien to my ears, a stark contrast to the eerie silence of the convoy. Desperation clawed at me. I couldn't take it any longer. The fear of being lost in this endless loop was giving way to a kind of frantic determination. I decided I had to confront the convoy, to force my way past these ghostly trucks and break free from this nightmare. The idea of breaking free became an obsession, a single, desperate plan to escape the torment. With every ounce of willpower I had left, I slammed my foot on the accelerator, trying to close the gap between my truck and the lead truck in the convoy. The storm seemed to rage harder, the wind howling louder, as if it were fighting against me. My truck roared forward, the engine straining against the fury of the storm. I could see the lead truck's dark form ahead, its shadowy outline barely visible through the torrential rain. But just as I thought I might succeed, the lead truck suddenly swerved directly into my path. The maneuver was abrupt, violent, forcing me to slam on the brakes. The truck skidded, tires screeching against the wet asphalt, and I felt a jolt as the vehicle came to a sudden, jarring stop. The engine sputtered and then stalled, the truck grinding to a halt in the middle of the road. The storm's fury seemed to reach a new, horrifying crescendo. The wind howled like a beast unleashed, the rain a relentless barrage against the cab. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline surging as I stared at the convoy. And then, as if in response to my desperate attempt to break free, the lights of the convoy suddenly flashed on. What I saw made my blood run cold. The trucks, once dark and ominous, were now illuminated in a ghastly, unnatural light. The sight was horrific. The trucks were not what they seemed. They were decayed, their exteriors covered in grime and rust, the windows shattered or obscured by some dark substance. But it was what was inside the trucks that paralyzed me with fear. I could see shapes moving behind the grime-covered windows, shadowy figures, their forms twisted and grotesque, shifting as if they were alive. The lights flickered and then went out, plunging me back into darkness. The convoy was once again a line of dark silhouettes against the storm, their eerie silence a stark contrast to the chaos outside. The sense of dread that had gripped me intensified, leaving me paralyzed, unable to move or think clearly. The reality of my situation hit me with brutal clarity. I was trapped in a nightmare, facing something beyond human comprehension, and there seemed to be no escape from the terror that enveloped me. With no other option left, I took a deep breath and made the decision to leave the relative safety of my truck. Stepping into the storm was like stepping into another world, a world of relentless rain and howling wind. The rain lashed against my skin, cold and stinging, while the wind roared around me like a banshee, making it nearly impossible to hear anything other than the storm's fury. The convoy had vanished, disappearing as suddenly as it had appeared. The road was empty, save for the howling wind and the relentless rain. I stumbled through the darkness, disoriented and terrified, each step a struggle against the elements. The storm seemed to have swallowed the road, erasing all traces of the nightmare that had unfolded. Hours felt like minutes as I fought my way through the tempest. Just when I was on the brink of collapse, the rain began to ease, and the wind's howl softened. Through the thinning mist, I caught sight of something familiar, the outline of road signs and the distant glow of streetlights. I had somehow found my way back to the road I had started on. The relief that washed over me was immense, but it was tainted by the horror of what I had just endured. My truck was still where I'd left it, miraculously untouched by the storm, but I couldn't stay there. I had to get out, had to find help. I finally made it to the nearest town, shaking and drenched but alive. As I walked into the small, dimly lit diner, I was greeted with curious stares from the few patrons who were there at that hour. I recounted my story, my voice trembling as I described the convoy, the endless loop, and the grotesque figures inside the trucks. The locals listened with a mix of disbelief and fear. They exchanged uneasy glances and whispered among themselves. One old-timer, his face lined with age and worry, leaned in and shared hushed rumors about a cursed stretch of highway. He spoke of lost souls doomed to wander, forever searching for a way out. He described it as a place where the veil between the living and the dead was thin, where nightmares could become reality. As I sat there, trying to steady my shaking hands and calm my racing heart, the full weight of the experience sank in. I had escaped the loop, but the haunting memories lingered. The storm had not only tested my physical endurance, but had also left a scar on my mind. Even now, as I drive those roads, the memory of that night clings to me like a shadow. The fear of another convoy, of being dragged back into that endless loop, never quite leaves me. Every time I see a flash of headlights in the distance or hear the rumble of a storm, a chill runs down my spine. The road, once a place of routine and familiarity, has become a reminder of the dark and twisted unknown that lies just beyond the edge of our understanding. The experience has left me forever wary of the road, and the possibility that one day I might find myself following another convoy into the storm. The terror of that night remains a constant reminder of how thin the line between reality and nightmare can be.
The ghost truck driver.
The road stretched out before me, a never-ending ribbon of asphalt cutting through the darkness. It was just past midnight, the time when the world seems to hold its breath, and the familiar hum of my truck's engine was the only sound keeping me company. The radio played softly in the background, an old country song that I'd heard 1,000 times before, but even that did little to break the eerie calm that settled over me. There's something about driving at night that makes everything feel different, more intense, more isolated. The towns I passed through were nothing more than ghostly blurs in the rearview mirror, their lights flickering like distant stars before fading into the blackness. I've driven these roads more times than I can count, but tonight, something felt off. Maybe it was the fog that clung to the edges of the road, or the way the trees seemed to close in around me, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out of the darkness. As I rounded a bend on a particularly remote stretch of road, I saw her. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. After all, who in their right mind would be out here at this hour? But there she was, standing by the roadside, her thumb outstretched in that universal gesture for a ride. The headlights caught her just right, illuminating her figure against the backdrop of the fog. She looked disheveled. Her dark hair was tangled, hanging over her face in messy strands, and her clothes were worn and slightly outdated, like something you'd see in an old photograph. For a moment, I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to keep driving, to leave her standing there in the cold. But something about the way she stood there, so alone, tugged at me. Maybe she was in trouble. Maybe she had no other choice but to hitchhike at this hour. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and pulled over, the truck groaning as it came to a stop beside her. She didn't move at first, just stood there staring at the ground as if she hadn't expected anyone to actually stop. I rolled down the window and leaned out. "You need a ride?" I called out, my voice cutting through the stillness. She looked up then, and our eyes met. There was something in her gaze, something distant, almost hollow. It sent a shiver down my spine, but I pushed the feeling aside as she nodded slowly and approached the truck. She climbed in without a word, settling into the passenger seat with an almost robotic motion. As I pulled back onto the road, I tried to make small talk, ask where she was headed, but her responses were brief, almost like she wasn't really listening. Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper, and she never once looked directly at me. Instead, she stared straight ahead, her eyes fixed on some unseen point in the distance. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about her, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The air in the cab felt colder, the shadows deeper. It was as if the night itself had followed her into the truck, wrapping around us both in an icy embrace. I drove on in silence, the tension in the air growing thicker with every mile. The further we went, the more I regretted picking her up. Something about this woman, about the way she sat there so still and quiet, sent my mind racing with unease. But there was no turning back now. The road ahead was long, and we were in it together, for better or for worse. The road began to change as we approached a small, almost forgotten town. The smooth asphalt gave way to cracked pavement, and the streetlights, which had been sparse to begin with, flickered weakly, casting long, wavering shadows across the road. The fog seemed to thicken around us, wrapping the truck in a ghostly shroud as we drew closer to the town's edge. I noticed the woman shift beside me. She had been so still, so silent, that I'd almost forgotten she was there. But now, she was glancing out the window, her eyes darting from one shadowy building to another as if she was looking for something or someone. Her hands gripped the seat, knuckles white, and her breathing grew shallow. The air inside the cab felt heavy, thick with an unspoken tension that set my nerves on edge. "We're almost there," I muttered, more to myself than to her. The words felt hollow, like a desperate attempt to fill the unsettling silence between us. The town came into view, a collection of rundown buildings clustered together under the dim light of a few street lamps. It was the kind of place that had seen better days, the kind of place people passed through without a second thought. I spotted a diner up ahead, its neon sign flickering weakly, casting a sickly green glow over the cracked pavement outside. I pulled the truck into the small parking lot, the tires crunching over loose gravel as I brought it to a stop. "This is it," I said, turning to the passenger seat. But the words died in my throat as I realized the seat was empty. My heart skipped a beat, then began to race as I looked around, searching for any sign of her. The door was still locked, the seatbelt unbuckled but untouched. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Panic clawed at my chest. I knew she had been there. I had seen her, spoken to her. But now, sitting alone in the cab, I felt a cold dread seep into my bones. How could she have just disappeared? I hadn't heard the door open, hadn't felt the truck shift as she left. It didn't make any sense. I fumbled with the door handle, my hands trembling as I pushed it open and stumbled out into the cool night air. The fog clung to the ground, swirling around my feet as I hurried toward the diner, my mind reeling with questions. The bell above the door jingled as I burst inside, the warmth of the diner a stark contrast to the chill that had settled in my bones. The place was nearly empty, just a couple of locals nursing their coffee at the counter and an old man reading a newspaper in the corner. I must have looked half-crazed as I approached the counter, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "Did you see her? The woman. I was giving her a ride, and she's gone. Did she come in here?" The waitress behind the counter, a tired-looking woman with deep lines etched into her face, exchanged a wary glance with the man sitting at the counter. He frowned, setting his mug down slowly before turning to face me. "What woman?" he asked, his voice calm but with an edge that sent a shiver down my spine. "The woman I picked up on the road," I insisted, my voice rising in desperation. "She was right there, in my truck, and now she's gone." The man's eyes darkened, and he let out a heavy sigh. "Son," he said, his voice low and grave, "you're not the first to come in here with a story like that." My confusion must have shown on my face because he continued, leaning in slightly as if to make sure no one else heard. "Years ago, there was an accident just outside of town. A young woman, she died on that road late at night. Ever since then, folks say they've seen her out there, hitchhiking, trying to find her way home. But she never makes it." A cold chill ran down my spine as the weight of his words sank in. The woman, the one I had picked up, was she? Could she really be? I staggered back, my head spinning. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I had been driving alone. The woman, whoever or whatever she was, had never been real, or at least not anymore. I stumbled out of the diner, the locals' uneasy stares following me as I made my way back to the truck. The fog had thickened even more, swallowing the town in a blanket of white. I climbed back into the cab, the seat next to me as empty as it had been when I first started the drive. The town felt like a ghost itself, a place trapped in time, where the living and the dead crossed paths in the dead of night. And as I drove away, the shadows of the past clinging to my truck. I couldn't help but glance at the passenger seat, half expecting to see her sitting there once more. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out of that town. Even after I had put miles between myself and that forgotten place, the memory of the woman lingered like a shadow that refused to be left behind. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that it had all been a trick of the mind, some twisted illusion born out of exhaustion. But deep down, I knew better. There was something real, something I couldn't explain. The next few days passed in a haze, the hours blurring together as I kept driving, trying to outrun the fear that had lodged itself in my chest. But the further I went, the more I found myself thinking about her. The more I tried to forget, the clearer the details became. I couldn't stop picturing her standing by the roadside, her dark eyes empty, her voice a whisper lost in the wind. I needed answers. I couldn't keep going with this weight pressing down on me, so I started asking around. Other truckers, locals in the towns I passed through, anyone who might know something about that stretch of road. The stories I heard only deepened my unease. They all spoke of the same tragedy, a young woman who had died in a brutal accident on that very road. Some said her car had skidded off the highway on a rainy night, plunging into a ravine where it wasn't found for days. Others claimed she had been hit by a passing truck, her body thrown into the woods where it lay undiscovered for weeks. No matter the version, the ending was always the same. Her body was never properly laid to rest. It was said that her spirit was trapped, cursed to relive the night she died, wandering the road in search of a way home. Some even believed that she was looking for someone to help her, someone who could finally set her free. But every time she got close, she vanished, doomed to repeat her endless journey. The more I learned, the tighter the fear coiled around my chest. I knew now that the woman I had seen, had spoken to, wasn't just a figment of my imagination. She was real in some way that defied logic and reason. And she wasn't done with me. The first time it happened, I was somewhere in the middle of nowhere, the road stretching out into the night like a black ribbon under the pale glow of the moon. The radio crackled with static, the faint echoes of a song fading in and out as I drove. I was just beginning to think I might make it through the night without incident when I heard it. A whisper, soft and indistinct, but unmistakably there. I froze, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The whispering grew louder, a chorus of faint voices murmuring just on the edge of hearing. I glanced around the cab, searching for the source, but there was nothing, just the darkness pressing in on all sides and the steady hum of the engine. Then, in the rearview mirror, I saw her, a fleeting glimpse, just a flash of dark hair and pale skin before she disappeared into the shadows. My heart leaped into my throat, and I whipped my head around, but the passenger seat was empty. The cab was empty. It happened again the next night and the night after that. Each time, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Objects began to move on their own. A pen rolling off the dashboard, the radio dial turning by itself. And always, just on the edge of my vision, I would see her, standing in the road or sitting in the passenger seat, her eyes filled with a sadness that chilled me to the bone. Sleep became a distant memory. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. She would stand at the side of the road, her thumb outstretched, or sit in the truck, her gaze fixed on me with a silent plea. But there was something else too, something darker. The longer I looked, the more I felt her despair, her desperation. She wanted something from me, something I wasn't sure I could give. The nightmares were the worst. In them, I was back on that road, driving through the fog with the woman beside me. She would turn to me, her face twisted with grief, and speak in that soft, hollow voice that echoed in my mind long after I woke up. But I could never understand what she was saying. Her words were always just out of reach, lost in the wind. Every time I woke, drenched in sweat, I felt her presence growing stronger, as if she was getting closer with each passing night. The boundary between the waking world and the nightmare was blurring, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the two became one. I was running out of time. Whatever she wanted, whatever unfinished business had tied her to this world, I had to find a way to end it, before it ended me. I couldn't keep living like this, on the brink of madness, haunted by something I couldn't understand, couldn't fight. The nightmares, the whispers, the constant presence of that woman, her ghost, had pushed me to the edge. I knew I had to do something, anything, to put an end to it. So I made the only decision I could. I would confront her. I would go back to where it all began. The road to the town felt longer this time, every mile weighed down by the fear that had become my constant companion. The fog was thicker, clinging to the earth like a shroud, and the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. As I drove, the memories of our first encounter played over and over in my mind, each detail sharpening the sense of dread that twisted in my gut. The town looked even more desolate than before, as if it had aged decades in the short time since I'd last been there. I parked the truck at the edge of the town, close to where the accident had happened, or where they said it had happened. The locals had given me all the details they could, their eyes filled with pity or fear, warning me not to dig too deep. But I couldn't stop now. I walked to the site of the crash, the gravel crunching under my boots as I approached the spot where the road curved sharply. It was easy to imagine how it had happened. The slick pavement, the narrow bend, the fog hiding the danger until it was too late. I could almost hear the screech of tires, the shattering of glass, the final, fatal impact. The locals had told me to leave an offering, something to appease her restless spirit. I had brought a few things: a bouquet of wildflowers, a small candle, even a rosary I'd found in the truck. I arranged them carefully on the ground, feeling the weight of the moment settle over me like a dark cloud. Then I knelt, the cold earth biting through my jeans, and said a prayer. I wasn't much for religion, but in that moment, I would have tried anything. But as the last words left my lips, the air around me grew colder, and the tension only seemed to thicken. I felt her presence more strongly than ever before, a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The wind picked up, whispering through the trees in a language I couldn't understand, and the fog swirled around me like a living thing. I waited, hoping for some sign that my offering had been accepted, that she would find peace and leave me be. But there was nothing, only the oppressive silence and the growing certainty that I was out of my depth. I stood, my knees stiff and my hands trembling, and made my way back to the truck, my heart sinking with each step. Whatever I had done, it wasn't enough. The haunting wasn't over, it had only just begun. I barely had time to close the door behind me before she appeared. This time, there was no gradual build-up, no eerie whisper in the dark. One moment, the truck was empty, and the next, she was there, sitting in the passenger seat as if she had never left. Her appearance was sudden, so abrupt that I jumped, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. She turned to face me, her eyes, those hollow, sorrowful eyes, boring into mine. For the first time, she spoke, her voice a cold, hollow echo that sent a shiver down my spine. "Take me home." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that threatened to crush me. I didn't know what to do. Where was her home? But the look in her eyes, the desperate plea buried beneath the coldness, left me with no choice. I nodded, barely able to find my voice. "All right," I whispered. "I'll take you home." I started the truck, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. She didn't say anything else, just sat there, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. I had no idea where to go, no idea what home meant to her. But as I began to drive, she guided me, her presence pulling me in the right direction. We drove in silence, the road stretching out before us like a path to another world. The fog thickened, the town fading into the distance behind us, until all that remained was the road, the truck, and the two of us. The atmosphere was suffocating, the air heavy with the weight of things left unsaid. Finally, we reached the edge of town, where the road gave way to a narrow dirt path leading into the woods. The trees closed in around us, their branches gnarled and twisted, casting long shadows in the dim light of the moon. She motioned for me to turn, and I followed her silent command, the truck lurching as it left the paved road. The path wound deeper into the forest, the trees growing thicker, the darkness more oppressive. And then, through the tangle of branches and vines, I saw it, a house or what was left of one. It was an old, decaying structure, half swallowed by the forest, its walls crumbling, its windows shattered. Vines crept up the sides, their tendrils curling around the wood like the fingers of the dead. I pulled the truck to a stop, the engine sputtering as it died. I turned to her, but before I could say anything, she was gone. Just like before, she had vanished without a sound, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence. The passenger seat was empty, as if she had never been there at all. I sat there, staring at the house, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was thick with the scent of rot and decay, and the silence was absolute, pressing in on me from all sides. The house loomed before me, a monument to the past, a place where time had stood still. And yet, it felt alive, as if it were watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. I knew I had to go inside. This was where she had led me, where she had wanted to go. But the thought of stepping out of the truck, of crossing that threshold into the unknown, filled me with a terror I had never known. But there was no turning back now. I had come this far, and there was only one way to end it. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come, and opened the door. The next morning, I woke with the weight of the previous night pressing heavily on my chest. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale light across the town as I made my way to the authorities. My hands still trembled as I walked into the sheriff's office, the events of the last few days replaying in my mind like a looped nightmare. I told them everything, about the woman, the haunting, and the abandoned house she had led me to. They listened with a mix of skepticism and unease, their expressions unreadable as I described the decayed building in the woods. When I mentioned that her body was never found, that she had been left behind in that forsaken place, something shifted in their demeanor. It was as if they were remembering an old wound that had never properly healed. After much convincing, they agreed to send a team to the house. I insisted on going with them, needing to see this through to the end. As we drove back to the edge of town, the same path I had taken the night before, I could feel the tension building inside me, a knot of dread tightening with each passing mile. The house looked even worse in the daylight, its decay more pronounced, the years of neglect etched into every rotting board and shattered window. The officers moved cautiously as they approached the building, their flashlights cutting through the gloom as they pried open the creaking door and stepped inside. The stench of mold and decay was overwhelming, but I forced myself to follow them. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind through the broken windows, sent a shiver down my spine. But I knew we had to find her. This was the only way to end it. It didn't take long. The officers found a door leading to a basement. Its hinges rusted and its wood splintered. The air grew colder as we descended the narrow stairs, the darkness closing in around us. At the bottom, in a small, hidden room, we found her. A collection of bones, brittle and broken, tangled in the remnants of clothing that had long since decayed. The sight was enough to make my stomach turn, but I forced myself to stay, to bear witness to the truth that had been hidden away for so long. They gathered her remains with a somber reverence, the gravity of the situation settling over us all like a shroud. The burial was simple but dignified. The town gathered to pay their respects, the story of the woman who had haunted their road finally coming to light. As her remains were lowered into the earth, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me, like a weight lifting from my shoulders. The air seemed lighter, the oppressive tension that had hung over the town dissipating with each shovel of dirt that covered her grave. But even as the final prayers were said, and the townspeople began to disperse, I knew I would never truly be free of her. The haunting had stopped, yes, but the memories remained, etched into my mind like scars that would never fade. I left the town soon after, eager to put distance between myself and the place where my life had been irrevocably changed. But no matter how far I traveled, I couldn't escape the lingering fear that clung to me like a second skin. Every time I passed by that stretch of road, I felt a chill, a cold reminder that some spirits never rest easily. The open road, once a symbol of freedom, now felt like a cage, the miles stretching endlessly before me as I drove from one place to the next. I was no longer just a trucker. I was a man who had come face to face with the unknown, who had seen the darkness that lies just beyond the edge of our understanding. And though she was finally at peace, I knew I would never forget her, the phantom hitchhiker who had sought her final ride home. Even now, as I sit here, miles away from that cursed town, I can still feel her presence, a shadow at the edge of my vision, a whisper in the wind. The road may have taken her to her final rest, but it left me with a story that will haunt me for the rest of my days. And as I drive through the night, the headlights cutting through the darkness, I can't help but wonder, what other spirits are out there, waiting for someone like me to come along and hear their story?